So welcome everyone to the session 14 on reflecting how change is supposed to happen. This is a bit of a special session because we'll run it with our colleagues from the GRC, Christian, Veronica, and Beata. Say hi. Christian, say hi, see if we can hear you.
Hi, hello, good morning.
Okay, we can hear you. That's good. We're just saying minor things. Okay, all right. So I'll walk you first through the agenda. We'll have a first part where we have a presentation about what exactly we are going to talk about today, and then in the second half of the session, we'll have a group activity to introduce a tool that'll help us navigate long-term change developed by the GRC. So we'll do that in breakout rooms. The breakout rooms will be facilitated and you'll stay in the breakout rooms for the whole second part of the session. We'll have more details on this after by the end of the first bit. So you'll see there's two small breaks built into the program today. So let's dive in. As always, first, where does the session fit within the RRJ? So we're still in the realms of phase 2, building a last step of phase 2, where we have talked about futures, build our shared vision, but now we're moving into translating this vision into a strategy. What does that look like, and what tools do we have to do that type of work? So what do we expect to achieve today? Better understand what we need in order to be able to map and act in long-term complex challenges, because that's what we're trying to do with our climate resilience strategy. Explore, and I say very high-level exploration of transformational change, and learn about tools that can be used in this process. So hopefully by the end of the session, you'll have some better understanding of these three themes. But before that, and to prepare for our breakout session, I'll ask you to rename yourself with one of these letters that is going to copy in the chat if possible. I can also copy them in the chat to indicate which climate hazards would you like to explore today. You can choose more than one letter. So I'm going to give the example of my name. So if I'm Carla, I'm going to be wildfires and heat. So I put a W and H. This will help us reassign yourself to different groups. So please do that while we continue with the presentation. You can take a little bit of time. So let's dive in. We'll start with a little check-in, and for that, I asked my colleague Anka from the Red Cross to kickstart us with that. Stop sharing and give the floor to Anka.
Hello, everyone. My name is Anka, so I thought we could check in and kickstart this session by doing a bit of a rant. I'm going to share a link in the chat now. If you can go into this Good Games platform, where you will, in a moment, find some cartoons. Hopefully, these cartoons will inspire you to think about things that you find frustrating with dealing with complexity, and also trying to manage long-term change in a world that's usually made for short-term wins. So we are not looking for any solutions here or anything else. We just want to allow you to let out your frustrations. So rant about anything that that pops in your mind while you look through these cartoons. I'll give you around 6-7 minutes to rant. There's 8 cartoons in total, so you can go through the cartoons, rant about something that you find annoying, and also if you see a comment from anyone else and you can relate to that, please like it, and then we'll kind of look through all the comments and likes together. So I'll give you now, around 6 minutes. Let's look at what you guys have written. We have 39 comments, so a lot of ranting. You guys probably all are looking at the game platform, but I'm just going to share my screen for a second as well. So let's see which ones have the most likes. Air conditioning, which I personally agree with. Does that answer any actual problems? Probably not. Politicians feeding on people's wish for easy solutions. Mass decision is the right decision? Excellent question. Seems like this one was really inspiring. Let's see the next cartoon. Never-ending path of behavioral change. It does seem like that right now. One reason why people are not acting for a better climate. Daunting and sometimes feels lonely. I can relate to that one. A joke about the theory of change. Me every time I try to do a theory of change. Clarity needed. There's quite a few about clarity. Here's a little joke that has 2 likes about the Horizon Europe process. A miracle occurs. Today we will speak about complexity. Do we see complexity as a miracle? DeepSeek. I'm glad you put AI because that's also something that will intertwine in today's group activity. How do we know all the impacts? I think that's part of the issue that we never can really know, especially with unprecedented events that climate change will give us. Push the boundaries. Clear communication is not easy in a complex world. I think that is true as well. Okay, I think that's our last cartoon.
Thank you, Anka. And thank you everyone for ranting a little bit with us. We just wanted to get you give space to acknowledge that you're all been doing this type of work and that we have faced some similar challenges. So let's get back to it. So talking about difficult challenges and long-term challenges and complex challenges, let's look at the case we had heard about briefly a couple of sessions ago, the Arne Nijmegen ambition by 2120. I don't even know how to say that. How do you plan for 2120? So that's almost 100-year times now. Or can you make a plan at all? That's kind of a rhetorical question. This seems like a kind of an enterprise we don't have a blueprint for, but we do have. We'll have plenty of things that have been planned for 100 or more years. They're sitting in our cities, and they've been built through generations and through ambitions that do not lay in one person, but on communities and so on. So we're basically asked to build cathedrals, but what we have, in fact, is our theory of change. As many of you probably have encountered a theory of change or logic model as one of the tools you use to design projects or programs that you run within your service or unit. This is the most common use tool to assess the effectiveness of or whether a project or a plan is the right one. And as you see, it's the structure that everybody might know very well, very linear, with 5 elements, very simple, very lean, that might not necessarily account for complexity. So how do we build 100 years or more cathedrals that stand over 1,000 years time with a little theory of change? The answer is that this might not be the right tool for the job, but it might. So let's look at 5 failures or pitfalls of theory of change and common project management that we find that fail to address complex change. And we'll go through all these pitfalls in detail, neglecting context, overconfidence in our influence, fallacy of unidirectionality, beliefs about stability, uncertainty, and the failure to adapt and capture emergent changes. So let's go by one. What do we mean by neglecting context? So the theory of change is this kind of linear and lean model where we say, as in one of the cartoons, we'll give school lunches and we'll end up finish world hunger. And so we're kind of building this linear process within a complex word, and this probably has been the most used cartoon ever, but still is useful for this specific point. So I think the tools that we use and the pressure that we get from planning sometimes force us to assume that our projects or plan exist in the vacuum and they are not affected by context. So that our interventions need to be planned within a blank canvas to a certain extent. So how can we address this caveat? And this is embedded in the RRJ using the system maps and the system mapping process through project design, not only at the beginning, but as a way to understand how this intervention is embedded in a large set of relationships and how it will be, how it will affect and will be affected by the system, because it's not something that we do on our own. The second pitfall, and it relates again to the system map idea, is the fallacy of unidirectionality. These linear models, which go from input to activity to output and outcome, assume that everything is a linear process where if you push a ball here, it's going to fall and knock something. While we know from complex systems that everything has feedback loops, everything is interrelated, actors and relationships emerge that then transform as the project evolves. So having that vision in time and trying to understand what are those feedback loops and interrelations that are going to affect our project planning is really essential in counteracting this lack of this unidirectionality of projects.
Fallacy of unidirectionality, we have systems that have been, this was about linear versus feedback loops in our way of designing and planning a project. The other common pitfall is overconfidence and overfocus in our influence. And I think in a lot of projects, we either are tempted to focus on what we can control, what is within our boundaries of direct influence or direct control, rather than looking at what can we steer or influence through an intervention. As we saw in the cartoon, for instance, when we think of behavioral change, what we can do is interventions that, if we focus only in the control, there's interventions that have limited effectiveness, or the effectiveness of what we can see is very, very small. If, for instance, we take the example of giving cash grants for a specific initiative, or putting a tax, reduced tax on purchasing a specific technology, which is a very simple intervention. Within a control is the fact that we give this tax break. Whether people are going to use that tax break or not, and whether that is going to translate to buy, for instance, electric cars or whatever you want, that's within our sphere of influence. We have some degree of some capacity to incentivize that, but it's the will of the person buying the electric car that ultimately will make that decision. And our sphere of interest, which is, are those people really going to move to more green behaviors? That means that purchasing electric cars will that lead to generally attitudes related to the use of carbon neutral technologies. That's within our sphere of interest. It's not something we can control. We have very little influences, but it's ultimately what we want to see as a change. And having these three layers, it's important because while we might focus on activities within these two spheres, it's important to always ask ourselves, what is the ultimate purpose of the project? So if a project is about building a bridge to an island, the purpose of the project is not building a bridge of an island. The purpose is to connect the island with the inland for a reason, because people in the island want to work in the inland, because they need access to health. And when you look at the ultimate purpose, it makes you ask yourself, what are the other alternatives, or are there competing solutions that might be either supporting, contributing to my ultimate goal, or that I might be competing with what I'm doing. This might be long term, and this might be co-evolving. So by that we mean, while one project might lead to some type of change, or my intervention within 3 years, I don't know, will change behaviors in some way. Ultimately, what we want to see as a long-term goal is something that needs to be built over time, and that talks about this idea of having multiple projects working together for the larger aim. Core pitfall is this belief about stability and certainty. So when we plan a project, and I don't know your situation, I've only seen the situation of projects at work and the public sector before. We assume that everything is a closed system, and then if we give people something, everything will be the same within even the 3 years time. And I know it's short term, but a lot of things can happen, especially we're talking on about complex systems. This is a framework that some of you might have heard about, and I'm not going to go into detail, but I think it's nice to highlight the complexity of the level of complexity of different type of interventions, and like this cartoon because of the analogy with game. So simple problems are like this game, which so I think it's the name in English, but probably has very different names in other languages. But you just, there's a very simple math and like 3 solutions. So you learn to play it when you're 5, and that's it. So in the way we act is very linear. Like we look at what the problem is and we respond. And we make categories and we put things into boxes. When you get to a complicated game like Task, which you can learn to play when you're 5 years old, but definitely something you can spend the rest of your life learning, you have to analyze, you get into the analysis of problems. It is complicated because it requires expert knowledge, knowledge that you need to build it over time. But it also kind of puts you in this sort of analytical approach where you look at your board, you understand what the challenge is, bring your knowledge that you have onto the table, and you respond with an answer. However, when we look at complex problems, so like poker, where it really depends on the responses of others, how you're going to respond, we get in a different mode of acting. We prove, and then we sense and respond. So if you're playing poker, and I'm a terrible gambler, so I'm not going to give good examples, but you sense the room, you prove, you drop a card, you take a bet, and you see what that does in the system, and then you respond. So this idea that we are first, not without knowledge, because the more you know about the game, the more experience you have, the better are you prepared to decide what proof are you going to, what experiment, what test, what cards are you going to put on the table. But if you but you need to take that first step in order to understand how the room is going to respond. And this is the realm of the work that we're the work that we're doing. The work with complexity and the work with adaptation might have some simple and complicated solutions available, but many of the solutions, because they depend on the community, depend on change of others, are about probing, and about experimenting, putting something out there, testing it, getting feedback, and then responding. And understanding that doesn't mean that expertise is not required. Quite the opposite. You bring your expertise, but you bring it in a very different attitude. And then we have the chaotic space, which is these Pictionary, I guess that was the game there, where you first need to act. So the other kind of mode is the house is on fire. So when you have an emergency, you deploy everything that you have, you respond to the emergency, and then you look back and you say, what was the right thing to do? I mean, it's a complete different mode of acting. So this framework just kind of highlights that when we design interventions to complex problems, the understanding that a problem is complex requires that we design interventions of this kind and not interventions of this kind where we spend a lot of time trying to break the problem into pieces and devising a perfect strategy, because the perfect strategy doesn't exist. The perfect strategy will emerge as we try out what we're going to do. The last pitfall is this failure to adapt and capture change as it emerges. And this is, I think, the one that we often find more challenges, at least in the work that we do with Climate Kick, because it's easy to say and very hard to implement. And I just finished the review, for instance, of a project that I'm helping to develop, and where we try to take this adaptive change approach. And it has worked quite well to a large extent, but one of the big criticisms was that we were not able, that other external people felt that our project was had no clear goals, and they didn't understand what the purpose of the project was because it was so adaptive. So it's actually very hard. You try to do it internally, but you also need to understand that adaptability is not within only your project, but also with your stakeholders. It needs to be clearly communicated. So these two complex diagrams I'll try to explain. The first one is about the portfolio approach that we heard last week, which is one way of dealing with complexity and multiple projects. But I'm not going to go into in depth. This is from the OECD, but basically has this three dynamics. So it recognizes that you create an ambition, you create a project strategy, but you need to manage it dynamically and constantly revise it as it goes. What I like of this inverted triangle is that, as well, in order to do that, it's not just having it on the project proposal. You actually need incentives. You need to have methods. You need to, there's a certain expertise to doing this type of work. You need to have the right data, the systems, what criteria you're looking at, but you also need to have the right mindset. People need to be willing this type of work. You have to have the culture within organization, capacities, and then leadership needs to be aligned. If leadership doesn't think that being adaptive is important, it really easily will fire back. And then translates into mechanisms. So people need to have incentives to be adaptive, sufficient allocation of resources, and sufficient and clear governance. And the incentives part is very important on a lot of projects or contexts. There's no incentives to fail, to say we didn't do the right thing or we could have done things differently. There's no value on reporting that, and valuing seeing failure as a learning and not as a failure is also part of being adaptive. So let's go back to the theory of change. Is it helpful? And I would say it still is. But this is one diagram from a very well-known guide of theory of change, where it distinguishes that the theory of change has generally two elements. The theory of action, which is normally a logic framework, and then the theory of change, which is this longer-term vision. So if we go back to this spheres of influence, this is in the sphere of desire change. And this is within our sphere of influence, not only our sphere of control. So this is where we can intervene. This is what will be translated as an action plan within the climate resilience strategy that you have to deliver. And these are the changes that we want to see. This is the strategy. And both are really important. If your action plan doesn't speak to your strategy, then it's not sufficiently, it's just not doing the job that it needs to do. In this specific task of understanding how change needs to happen, well, we want you to focus on that bit, the top part. What is the change that you want to see, and what are those long-term outcomes that you might not have full influence, but are really important to see that change? So actually, the upper part of a theory change, look, looks less of like a logic framework, like a linear thing, but it looks more like a river basin. And in that, I mean that within a river, you have certain paths that the water can take. They are not always taken. They depend on the conditions, if there's a drought, if there's floods. But there's certain directions that are more likely. And that's why you want to explore. You want to explore what are the potentials within the space of what you want to achieve, and how can you enhance those potentials, but not necessarily map every single thing that's going to happen, because that's simply not feasible for the time frame and level of complexity that you're dealing with. So let's look at an example, and we'll use this example before. This is Glasgow's visions and theory of change for their climate adaptation strategy. So the vision, it's a Glasgow city region that flourishes in a future climate. If you recall, in the session we had a couple of weeks ago, we went a little bit into the narrative. And it has this impact and long-term outcomes and intermediate outcomes. And let's look at the outcomes in detail. These are not all of them, but some examples to give you that sense of what is the level of foresight that we're looking into. So what are the impacts? People share their lives and places, so they're climate ready. Actors collectively create the right conditions for Glasgow city region to become a climate ready, and Glasgow city region is made climate ready by the way resources, services, and assets are directed and used. All those impacts are not within the sphere of control. It's nothing that we can directly manage. It depends on people, people shaping their lives. So those are citizens, actors collectively. So that's the government with the community, and then the resources that's managed. That includes as well private sector. So for instance, if we look at this one more in detail, the long-term outcome is a new normal achieved in societal priorities. So that's again outside of the sphere of direct control or influence, but within the intermediate outcome, which would be within the sphere of influence, political and economic systems supporting climate readiness are available. So there's something that can be done as, so they're mapping what can be done within the space of the local government to enable that longer term outcome about shifting societal priorities. If you look at this one, for instance, the longer term outcome, individual and communities are resilient. So that's outside of the sphere of control and influence. But the intermediate outcome is adaptation actions prioritize building resilience, particularly for the most vulnerable. So it's more concretely talking about what are the what is that the action, what are the qualities that the action plan needs to have in order to enable this longer term outcome. I think there was a poll here, right, Paloma? And we forgot about it. Should we do it? Yeah.
You see it?
No. The next one.
Oh, the second one?
Yeah, second one.
Wait.
So this question is about which of the pitfalls that we just heard about have you experienced in your work? should we leave it at, it's 39 participants, but I guess 25 answers, let's leave it there. So I'm going to end the poll. And what we have is that same as I have experienced, the failure to adapt is the most common pitfall. Overconfidence in an influence and then neglecting the context. Interesting that fallacy of unidirectionality and misplaced beliefs are, so that's great to hear that you're already working with an understanding of systems dynamics in your work. And 2 people said none of the above. So we'll definitely ask you for tips on how not to do the following. I'm going to be asking for tips because I've done all the other ones as well. All right, let's move on, and sorry for missing my own plan. Let's dive now on the why should we think about transformative change, and what is that we mean by that. And I just remember of the poll because actually we have another poll here. It's more open. So let's go to the third one. Can you enable the third poll, Paloma? Yeah. How comfortable are you working with the concept of transformative change or the transformative adaptation as you have heard it? Okay, so we have again 25 responses. I think that's everyone that we have today. All right. Okay, so a good mix. A few feel not somehow comfortable, but yeah, mostly in the middle. Okay. Okay, so let's dive quickly on why should we think about transformative change? What is transformative change? And I'm taking the IPBS recent definition. So the IPBS is the panel on biodiversity, the National Panel of Biodiversity and Ecosystems, for those who don't know it. And they came up recently with a report on transformative change. And they defined it as fundamental shifts in wide shifts in views, ways of thinking, knowing and seeing, structures, ways of organizing, regulating in government and practices, ways of doing, behaving, and relating. So basically shifts in all kind of elements that build the way we organize society. And that seems like a really big thing, especially for individual projects, or even for government or something that something that perhaps we don't have a blueprint for, but I would say we do have a relatively recent blueprint. If we can think of the Industrial Revolution, for instance, the moment of transformative change. And what does it tell us when we use this analogy with well, it's not an analogy, it's when we consider the Industrial Revolution as a moment of transformative change. It's the process that developed between the 1600s and the end of the 19th century. So it didn't happen overnight. And it was very place-based. So it started in Britain and in other parts of Europe. And then it moved and it spread. It developed unequally. It had pockets of development and pockets of change. It wasn't just an elite process. It's a process that changed also the way the common people saw themselves, the skills that they had. People became able to do types of work that they didn't have. They changed roles in society, and so on and so forth. And it was obviously strongly enabled by specific technologies, coal, electricity, and so on. So it's a rather complex intertwining of processes that create momentum that is very place-based and at the same time scales up. that creates momentum for that transformative change to happen. And many argue that we are at the point where we are looking at the second kind of industrial revolution, that is the revolution or the transformative change that we need to achieve to be able to cope or live within the boundaries of the planet and with the challenges that we have created through this transformative process that just happened. Every framework that we have of transformative change and transformative adaptation, and this is from a recent paper, Share in Futurium. I put a link on the slides if you're interested in reading it. Maps a lot of dimensions. So as I said, just with the example, transformative change and transformative adaptation is not a one-dimensional process. It has multiple dimensions. For instance, this one talks about scope. So to what extent it can scale, the depth, the type of impacts that it has, the temporality, whether it's persistent or not, and there's normative dimensions as well, whether it's inclusive, synergistic, and so on. So we're not going to go into depth of this because it will lead to a whole session, but it's just to acknowledge that the term itself is complex, and that also means that every project can be transformative in a way, and no project is perfectly transformative. I don't think there's another recent paper that was mapping around like 50 projects within the Netherlands on transformative adaptation, and as much as even those that claim to be more transformative are not transformative across all dimensions. And I think that's okay, as long as you embed it within a network of transformative initiatives, because as we saw from the example, the transformative element is not within the project itself, is how the project is embedded within a larger set of other processes that are seeking to lead to this larger transformation. So how do we do that? And these are concepts that we're going to be using in our session, the session that comes just after this talk on with the tool prepared by the GRC. This is just one dimension of transformative change. So before we look a little bit at the outcomes, not all of them are outcomes, but this is what is the process of transformative change. What does it look like? And this Fluxus diagram that you might have seen basically recognizes that in order to transform, you need to build the new and stop doing the old to some extent. Obviously, and as you know, transformation and evolution is always a mix of things. But if there's something we can do deliberately, is to create new things and then work towards diminishing old practices. And this we'll translate it into 3 concepts. The first one is scaling out. That means how do our projects nurture, facilitate the emergence or the growth of new practices, new ideas? To what extent are we supporting the new, the experimental, the exploratory to become more common, to easily grow? The second is the scaling deep, which is about shaking things up in a way. It's how do we create space for those things to emerge, not only by supporting them, so not only by supporting bottom-up initiatives, but by looking at the relationships, the culture, the beliefs, the incentives that people have in order to that inhibit them from doing things differently, or how we create space for for things that are not real at the moment. So if you think, for instance, of a more like radical circular economy project that seeks that people do not use plastic packaging anymore, it's not only about supporting the specific startup, but it's also what are the incentives that people have to use plastic packaging, how you reduce, how do you make sure that it's very easy and convenient for them to use refillable packages, so that's changing itself, the practice of going and buying your bag of rice. It's So how do you do that happen? How do you make that happen? And then the scaling up is how do you institutionalize that change? So how do you move from doing this as an experiment, as a niche, as something that a few communities are doing, to put it, to embed it into institutions, into rules, into norms? So how do you make a norm that everybody needs to bring their own refillable packages? And how do you move from kind of doing it something that, I don't know, people that are green aware do it, to something that everybody does it because it's the norm? So we'll work with this 3 concepts in the next exercise. And I think we're on time to go for a little break of 5 minutes. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. So I'll remind you to change your name if you haven't. Let's get back at 10:50, just 58, 59, yeah, 10:58, around this. And we'll dive directly into our activity for today. So Christian, are you there? Yes, you're there.
I'm here. Thank you, Carla. Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to be here with former colleagues of Climate Kick and with my new colleagues of JRC. We have Karel, Veronica, and Beata with us. And we are very enthusiastic about sharing with you this kind of new development on this tool that will help us to have a kind of a sense making and a mapping session on climate adaptation. So let's go and explain that how it's going to work. So this tool that we are going to use today is going to be part of a publication that will be soon online. And it's called Navigating Opportunity Spaces. And the logic of this tool is actually helping any kind of ecosystem, practitioner, companies, society, universities, even policymakers, to create awareness about the interplay between any kind of innovation activity and climate adaptation from a portfolio approach. So the idea is trying to bridge this gap and trying to see what is the opportunity of putting things together by using system thinking, but also focusing on the different governance structures that each context or each ecosystem may have, and also the maturity for doing this, to bridging this gap. So some activities and some opportunities might be more compatible than others. And as part of that, supporting the discussion on regional strategies and for accelerating climate adaptation. So the overall tool and publication have these 3 parts that are understanding what this means opportunity spaces, learning through examples. There are going to be a collection of examples that will look a little bit like this, very visual, very simple in terms of what the actors are doing, what are the goals, what are the activities. And finally, the mapping tool, that is what we are going to use today, that have this kind of different purpose that we can use and combine. First one is sense making and a kind of a self-assessment about what is going on in our system. So what are the elements that we can connect in terms of these opportunities? Some particular steps that facilitate co-creation through this portfolio analysis about where is the gap, where I can do something else, where I can actually connect the dots, but also this extra element about monitoring, evaluation, and foresight, about projecting what is there in terms of what we can do in the future. And indeed, today, what we are going to do is a combination of both elements, the kind of the self-assessment and the mapping, and also bringing a little bit of monitoring, evaluation, and foresight to challenge what we understand about what is transformative. So in the first part, we are going to have 4 steps that now we are going to explain about sense-making and assessment. Then we will have a break. You will stay in your breakout rooms. The idea is like the break is just to have a pace in the exercise. And in the second part, you will stay in the same breakout rooms and keep working on monitoring, evaluation, and foresight, like challenge your mapping of your ecosystem, etc. So the point is that we are going to use, because we are all from different organizations and different regions, we are going to use a fictional case, Macondo, that, as I understand, has been used in trainings before. And you will be assigned according to your preference to the different climate hazard that you have suggested for yourself. So the idea is that over these two parts, you will address what are actually the opportunities to work in innovation in general with a portfolio approach on this climate hazard in the case of Macondo. So let's go to the explanation of the step-by-step. So the first thing that you will be asked to do as part of understanding the case and trying to get into the mapping is trying to identify individually as a person, then you can discuss in a group different key impacts on the target topic, like for example, floods, okay? And the tool will have this shape where the challenge in the center that already is kind of addressing, for example, floods as kind of climate adaptation. And then what are the kind of impacts that we want to have in terms of this challenge by 2030 and 2050. And as part of that, we will generate conversations with the different participants in order to see what are the commonalities about this kind of impact elements. And that will allow us to go to the next step. Is like, well, if we have this kind of impact that we want to achieve in this particular climate hazard, what are the activities and processes that can be connected to address this and to achieve that impact? Okay, so the idea is trying to consider a variety of activities and actions from portfolio approach, from a project, activity, a service, a technology, a partnership, something connected to governance, something that could be connected to identify new information, something that could be connected to create agreements, any kind of activity and process that could be related to the impacts that we want to achieve. And then the following question is a little bit obvious. It's like, who could be part of that activity and process? So who are the main actors that can support this activity and also to support the achievement of this impact that we want to wish? As you can see, it could be that in the map you have different paths, okay? Because depending on the different impacts, and that's the idea that we want to create, that there are different possibilities in an ecosystem to achieve multiple impacts in different areas with different actors and different activities. That's the idea of the sense making of, that's the portfolio. That's how it works in reality in a region. You have different programs, different activities, different projects that are connected or not, but organically are part of your ecosystem. So that's why we want to ask you in the last step of this first part is like map transactions and resource flows. And the idea here is trying to see, well, this actor, this activity might be connected with this one, or we can use the same information, or we can use the same, for example, if we are talking about capacity building, the same approach, the same material, or if we are talking about something learned, for example, on pre-commercial or green procurement, or this practice can also be used here with this project and this activity. So the idea of connecting the dots here is trying to see that there are transversal elements or also vertical elements, like from one impact to the other, we can use this result to move forward. And this is going to give us a little bit the idea about that the elements in our ecosystem is going to are going to be flexible in terms of providing these opportunities to make things happen. So after this, you will have a break for 5 minutes, and then we will invite you in the second part to challenge what you have included in your map with these two questions. Does this portfolio respond to the climate challenge? Is it really kind of addressing the challenge? Is this kind of enough on what else needs to be done? And how we are going to challenge that in two ways. We are going to bring a future element, but also we are going to think about the transformative aspect of what we are trying to do, like kind of more disruptive innovation. So in order to do that, the first thing that we are going to ask is we are going to invite you to pick up a mega trend to bring this kind of future-oriented approach. So we have selected these 4 out of 14, just for the sake of the exercise. So, for example, technological change and interconnectivity, changing security paradigm, increasing demographic imbalance, and climate change and environmental degradation. That is very broad, but the idea is connecting with other hazards that might be in discussion today. So the idea is trying to identify at this step which megatrends might be affecting what we are proposing, and just trying to make a reflection. So, for example, if this impact and these activities and actors are really future-proof, are they considering that this is going on? How this is going to affect what we are proposing? So it's a kind of a reflection about stress test, actually, about how these actions can resist what is going on in the context, and trying to see how this is related also to other potential megatrends or other elements that might be affecting the way that we are trying to achieve this kind of impact. So the second step is actually of this part is like trying to test how transformative our proposals are. And as part of that, what we are bringing is from the concepts that Carla mentioned before, these 3 ideas on transformative outcome, on scaling out, scaling deep, and scaling up, in terms of how these activities and this impact are trying to transform what we are trying to do in our ecosystem, in our region. So like nurturing, doing something more, like expanding something, scaling deep in terms of shaking things up and trying to see how we can be more disruptive and bringing novel things, or scaling up in terms of expanding something that needs to be consolidated in terms of policy or institutions and rule. So the idea is trying to see more strategically, so how this could be transformative enough to create a long-term strategy on climate adaptation. It might be a lot, by this time you might be already just finished, but in case that you have some time, the idea is that at the end of the exercise, you just make some reflection about if you can propose an intervention, something that is missing in terms of all these reflections on future and transformative change in order to make it more transformative or more future-proof. So here you will have the chance to include an additional action or an additional element based on the reflection in the second part. And the idea is that by the end of the exercise, whether if it's possible to have the time or not, you just start to see something like, well, this is an opportunity space. If I connect the dots in this way, there is some space here where, for example, in the bottom right, you see that there is this connection over time, but in the on the left, you see that, well, there are this kind of transformative outcome of megatrends, or this collection of activities that are transversal, are interconnected. So there is something that I can do here about connecting different impact goals and different activities over time, but more transversally, not just like longitudinally, like 2030, 2050, but kind of in a portfolio approach. So that's the idea of the exercise, is creating this sense of what is an opportunity space in terms of connecting the dots, in terms of what we do, who can work, and make reflections about the innovative potential of working on climate adaptation. So I hope that you enjoyed the exercise. And before we jump into the breakout rooms, I'm going to go back to Carla to say the final words. Thank you.
Can you pass the next slide? I think just oh, I don't have to share my screen. Yeah. Thank you. So just the logistics. We'll go into breakout rooms, and that's this. So there's not going to be going back to the main room. You'll stay with your facilitators for the rest of the session. So we have 45 minutes. You'll get each of your facilitators get as far as you can on the exercise. It's really up to your group to see how far. Yeah, that's what I was going to drop in the link of the Miro. So we're going to work with Miro. Each facilitator is going to give you 5 minutes break at some point within the group. Yeah, it's up to you to decide. So basically stay in the room. well, you work with the facilitation and you'll close the exercise within the breakout room. The only important thing is that if by the end of the session you really like this activity and you want to use it in your region, there's a great opportunity to actually work with the GRC, who's willing to provide one-on-one support to regions who are interested in using this tool. So if that's the case, please write to the email that's there in the slides, and also we'll copy it in the chat and indicate that you are interested in this. And with that, I'll just pass it on to, I guess Sylvia's going to put us in the rooms, right?
Already from this side. So thanks.
Okay. Yeah, so we're ready to go.
Great. I'm going to open the room in 3, 2, 1. Bye, everybody.